Hello, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar titled 5 Reasons to Rethink Backup with Hyperconverged Infrastructure. My name is Kevin Collins from Unitrends, and I'm here with Joe Noonan, Vice President of Product Marketing and Product Management, and he'll be taking us through the presentation today. And don't forget, one lucky attendee will be walking away with a $100 Amazon gift card. We'll contact the winner via email after the webinar. But before we get started, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. This session will be recorded, and after the event, you'll receive an email with a link to the on-demand version of the webinar. I would also encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation. You can do so by typing them into the Q&A box on the bottom right of the player. We'll answer your questions at the end of the session. At this point, I'll turn it over to Joe and enjoy the presentation. And Joe, take it away.
Great. Thanks, Kevin, and thanks, folks, for joining us today. What's interesting about this one, so I've had the content done on this one for a while now, and I learned at the last minute that our marketing team likes to make sure that there's always kind of a list-based approach to our topics. So I don't know if I have 5 reasons to rethink backup with hyperconverged infrastructure, but what we're ultimately going to go through here are a number of core best practices when it comes to, really assessing how data protection, how business continuity works within this new form of infrastructure where, some of the vendors in this space are calling it invisible infrastructure because of some of the benefits that it brings to the table. So I think it'll still be nice and relevant for the folks here, so you hopefully walk away with a few good points on, maybe a few areas that you hadn't really thought of yet at this point. And if you're in the space looking at the hyperconverged infrastructure model for your business, or you're a partner that's selling, some of those vendors, I think this will be very helpful in being able to kind of talk through some of those benefits. And I haven't used this particular message in a while in some of my webinars, but it's an oldie but goodie where we talk about the less is more world. Because ultimately, from an IT perspective, it can be very, very interesting, but also very painful to have to deal with the fact that so much else is growing in the environment, yet the number of IT admins to manage it doesn't seem to be growing nearly as fast. There's less money to go around for the projects that are available, and there's less time to do all those things. And obviously, you want to have personal lives as well. And everybody just kind of expects everything to work perfectly, no downtime, no data loss, and anytime there's an issue, it's critical for them, and that makes it critical for you. So, I think the topic goes really well in that idea of less is more, because that's really kind of what's happening in this whole convergence era, where, in the past you had your chassis and your racks, and obviously, that's running a lot of the compute and storage and networking infrastructure for folks, and it's still very common in most environments today. And as we started to see integrated systems and convergence of the compute and the storage and the networking into different form factors that were obviously, better on TCO related to, working with the actual infrastructure costs, the real estate costs, and obviously the rack costs. Now we're moving into these sort of multi-node interconnected systems that allow sort of infinite cloud scalability, and that drives to a lot of very cool new technologies that we'll talk about in a little bit. So I like this one particular stat here. So when we look at $1,135 to $2,270, and of course, depending on where you pull this data, you can find some variations to it. When we think about what this range represents, depending on the data center, this is actually the cost of one rack U in the data center. So we just talked about how hyperconvergence and that idea of convergence in general is driving down the amount of space required in data centers. That's real hard value and return for organizations that can start to leverage these types of solutions and obviously start saving on costs specific just to the data center usage. And when we look at other aspects of the trends that are happening here, so software-defined systems are really kind of where we're at today. We're becoming a lot more focused on the software and leveraging more commodity-based hardware under the hood and letting the software handle things like redundancy and resiliency, availability, workloads moving across, different pools, and moving towards this idea of just these aggregated fabric-based resource pools, which is an interesting buzzword. And really what all this kind of stuff means is that things are getting more flexible, right? And as you start looking, and this comes from some Gartner reports, as you start looking towards 2020, they're starting to predict that you're going to start seeing this type of technology span across sites and clouds much more seamlessly for hybrid IT. And again, it just ultimately makes the infrastructure a little bit more negligible in the environment, and the value out of the software on top of it bringing a lot more to the table. And I think for all of you, I mean, you know, a lot of the benefits here just happen to be allowing you to become more dynamic across premises and across clouds, and not necessarily worried about where things are, but specifically just getting the value out of the resources that are available. And naturally, this is a budding, growing market for folks. When you look at all integrated systems, and that includes, you know, blades and regular converged systems versus just the hyperconverged systems, at a growth rate of about 18.7% a year, hyperconverged systems within that segment are growing the fastest by far. And that's obviously, you know, being driven a lot by one of the main leaders, Nutanix, went public, very successful with that. And what they did was obviously converge the servers, the storage, and the hypervisor into, you know, obviously this very interesting, scalable set of nodes that now doesn't even just run on its own hardware. You can actually purchase, you know, Nutanix software running on Cisco, UCS, and other types of platforms as well. So when we think about how a purpose-built kind of vendor-owned backup and continuity cloud can deliver a much better TCO and a more predictable cost structure than the utility-based model that you get with hyperscale clouds. And of course, we support physical and virtual environments when it comes to DR as a service, because that heterogeneous infrastructure is always pretty critical. And this is our Unitrends, some pretty good remarks in the Gartner world. So, when we look at the 2016 Magic Quadrant for DRAS and how things shifted into 2017, you can see by the image, a lot of downward pressure in that folks were having a hard time keeping up, and Unitrends really did a great job shining and moving to the right here as visionaries and being basically one of only 4 vendors that improved on both execution and vision. You can see top 4 in terms of overall capabilities, in terms of completeness and vision. But notice, in that top 4, you have IBM, SunGard, Infrascale, and Unitrends. Only Unitrends can really scale a down level to the small and medium-sized businesses, as well as up to the enterprise out of all 4 of those. IBM and SunGard are focused more on the enterprise, Infrascale more on SMB, and out of all 4 of them, we're the only solution that is also in the Gartner Data Center Backup Magic Quadrant, because backup is a key ingredient to a lot of disaster recovery as a service offerings. So being in both of those is a big part, I think, of the unique story that Unitrends brings to the table there. Now, that was just cloud in general and DRAS. So if we think about hyperconverged markets in this space, so what are we doing to integrate well with these types of solutions? So for instance, for Cisco UCS, right, we're not talking about necessarily their hyperconverged component, but with UCS and even HyperFlex, we are able to get in and uniquely protect and granularly recover a lot of that configuration information that you get from the UCS profiles. And that allows folks to save a lot of time. If they have bigger outages and they need to rebuild those, they don't have to go and rebuild them from scratch. They can basically just go and if somebody changes something in one little spot and they need to go and recover that one quick piece of it, you can do granular recoveries within those profiles very quickly. For Nutanix, we support all the hypervisors, including Acropolis, that need to be protected. Now, because we're going to talk a little bit about our announcement here, when it comes to Nutanix, and that's supported so for VMware, Hyper-V, and Citrix Xen Server, we have complete support at both the agent and agentless levels, meaning we can protect, guest operating systems like we would any machine, but we can also just use the hypervisor APIs to do simple protection across the entire environment without having to install agents. For Acropolis today, you do have to install agents. The integration with Acropolis to do hypervisor level backups is actually being done as we speak, and we should have that available in Q4 this year. So we actually just announced this today. The press release just went out on the wire, but Unitrends did announce that we will support Acropolis at the hypervisor level and integrate with Nutanix's APIs. So really excited about that and taking the partnership to a deeper level with the companies into the integration level, not just the support and go-to-market side of things. So lots of good stuff there. Hopefully this was helpful and just kind of understanding that you have a lot of options when it comes to backup and continuity when it comes to hyperconverged environments. There are native tools that are available to you. They can be a good thing to use to supplement your overall protection strategy. It's not a great idea, in my opinion, and you'll hear this from a lot of vendors, obviously selling backup, but you'll hear this from a lot of industry folks as well. Don't take my view of it since I am, working for a backup company, but taking that hat off and just looking at best practices in general, the fact that you have mixed environments typically is a great reason to make sure that you have sort of a unified solution across those mixed environments that can handle all forms of recoveries that are going to be required, whether they're granular or whether they are at a massive scale for full disaster recovery. Taking advantage of making sure that that backup data is separated from that production environment is important for compliance, as well as making sure that you have the resiliency you need not to lose data. And then of course, just capabilities where you're talking about extending things to DR or extending things to cloud. Again, vendors that understand this space and are experts in it are typically better than folks that are in just hyperconverged vendors that are trying to deliver up applications. So a lot of those native capabilities are good. They can supplement your overall backup and continuity strategy, but I think you want to make sure that you have a lot of those best practices in place with key vendors like Unitrends or any of our competitors that you think do a great job with that. So lots of good information for you to learn more. Lots of information on our website around what we do with Nutanix and Cisco UCS. So by all means, please look us up, call us, let us know if you have any questions, or take a look at the product with the demo, or if you like to just get hands-on, trials are available as well. So Kevin, I think that covers the presentation, and we want to get into the Q&A.
All right, Joe, thanks so much. Just remember, there's still time to ask a question. You can do so by typing your question into the bottom right-hand corner of the player, and we'll start the questions now. First question is, how does Nutanix cloud pricing compete with AWS?
So was it, I'm sorry, Kevin, was it how does Nutanix cloud, or how does
Unitran's cloud pricing.
Oh, okay, sorry, I heard you wrong. So good question, right, because it becomes, everyone loves to look at the pricing wars. I would definitely recommend we have a Unitrans cloud cost calculator, and Kevin, we can actually send a private email for the calculator to this person. So our pricing is actually based on protected capacity. And what that means is we price based on what you have in your environment before we ever back it up. Whereas AWS and Azure, they're going to price based on how much data gets stored, as well as they'll add cost in for sometimes write charges. So they'll charge you for storing the data, then they'll charge you for writing the data. And for any kind of retrieval whatsoever, whether you're just getting a file or you're pulling down an entire machine, anything you pull out, you're going to get hit with networking egress fees as well. And depending on whether you want advanced capabilities like WAN acceleration and things like that to make sure that your network is healthy during all that data transfer, which is pretty important, that can often shift you to solutions that require you to pay 5x more than the cheap storage in the cloud, because you have to start basically using compute and block storage out there. So all that means is that hyperscale clouds offer very, very low prices in terms of how you see those initially on a price book, but there are typically a number of hidden charges, and not even necessarily hidden. I think it's a bad word, right? So I'll take that back because I didn't mean it that way. There are a number of charges that folks aren't necessarily aware of that they're going to end up paying for all those just because it's a utility-based model, right? All the pricing is out there. They're very transparent about it, but it's more complex. And the complexity that goes along with storing lots of data and retaining lots of data in the cloud, what you'll find is that you can often see not only a difficulty in understanding what your cloud costs would be, but that they're much higher than leveraging Unitrans in our kind of very straightforward protected capacity model. So I would definitely, we'll get you the materials that show you how those numbers work in action, and let you decide for yourself what you think is best.
All right, next question is, are there plans to integrate with Cisco HyperFlex?
So I have to double check this one, because I believe we actually can, using our existing UCS profile capabilities, I believe we actually can do that with HyperFlex as well, just out of the box natively, because all the technology is pretty much the same. I could be wrong, so I want to double check that one. But in terms of being able to protect HyperFlex, I'm pretty sure you're running standard hypervisors and virtual machines on top of that infrastructure. And we can always either live in or have a recovery series external to it and protect that infrastructure as well. So the integration question, when I hear you ask that, I think I'm answering it from the perspective of integrating with the actual profile capabilities that are specific to Cisco. And I believe that does work, but I'll double check.
And as a follow-up to that question, are there any planned tight integrations with other hyperconverged vendors like Scale Computing, for example?
So we do continue to evaluate those markets consistently. We went with Nutanix because there's just a lot of good demand there, both in our partner base and in our customer base. We have a number of joint customers with Scale as well. They're a great partner. Scale leverages, I believe, KVM at this point. And one thing that Nutanix did to make this easier is that they opened up a set of their own APIs for backup that will allow vendors to integrate with and do this in an efficient way with change block tracking and things like that that make, you know, scalable backup a real reality. We've assessed at a deep level the KVM APIs, and they're lacking at offering the ability to do a lot of that. So it would either mean Unitrans gets in and starts writing a lot of it themselves, which gets a little risky and also just means the ROI has to be there, and we don't think it really is. Or those APIs need to obviously become a little bit more robust for us to to do more with. So those are the things that are going through our heads when we try to make those decisions. So best thing I can say is no, it's not on our current roadmap for the next 12 to 18 months, but it's something that we have spent time looking at and we continue to look at.
Okay, next question is, do you have any specs for the appliances, CPU, RAM, HDD, etc.?
Yep, all that stuff is right on the website. If you go to the product section under Recovery Series, under the pricing area, you'll be able to actually open up all the models, see all the specs, download the data sheet that has all the spec information there.
Okay, the next question is, how do we do a test drive?
So everything is there's two ways actually, so it's a good question. I always think it's so simple here because I have the trial of our software. So what you see on this particular link is the trial of our virtual appliance. Now the same software runs on our physical appliance. You can either download the virtual appliance for VMware, Hyper-V, and Zen Server. Again, we'll have an Acropolis version of that, so you can run inside of Acropolis when we launch our integration. And you can also, if you want to run a Recovery Series trial and see what it's really like to actually have that pre-integrated appliance, we can do eval. We provide eval units to folks as well. So those can all be requested right from the website from those product pages. Actually, I think the trial stuff is plastered all over the website, so you can probably get that right from the homepage.
Okay, the next question is, do you see Infrascale and Acronis as competitors in this space?
We do, not to as much of a degree as we see a lot of other vendors. So, you know, neither Infrascale or Acronis are on the backup Magic Quadrant, and as Unitrends spans both the SMB and the enterprise, we've been pulled into the enterprise quite a bit. So being on that MQ is a big deal considering there are a couple hundred vendors out there. But even in the SMB space and the mid-market space where we spend a lot of our time with customers, Infrascale we'll see here and there. It'd be wrong to say we don't compete with them, but not somebody we compete at great scale. And Acronis is another one where, you know, we've seen them a little bit in very small environments, but haven't really seen them in the bigger SMB side of things or the mid-market. Okay,
next question is, do you provide some sort of express route for dedicated connection?
So I'm not sure I understand that question. So I'm going to take a guess that this is related to Unitrends Cloud and being able to get bulk data, you know, across the wire in scalable fashion. Naturally, our cloud can certainly handle, you know, various networking requirements that might be needed. We're not like AWS and Azure that'll give you kind of those direct connect options. But what we do instead, and we think this is much more cost effective and it typically works really, really well, is we provide as a part of our service capabilities to leverage bulk seeding in and out using NAS devices or Recovery Series appliances. And not only has that been really good with getting a lot of data into the cloud, but when folks have real failure scenarios and they need to get their data back, having to wait to pull that over the wire or spend lots and lots of money on huge amounts of bandwidth is usually very preventative for a lot of folks leveraging the cloud, and Unitrends can overcome that with a very scalable outbound approach to getting data out of the cloud and shipping it out to customers. So if I did not answer that question in any way towards where you were going with it, please re-ask in maybe a different way, or we can take it offline.
Okay, we've got time for one more question here. Let's see. Can I use the Unitrends Cloud to fail over my Nutanix environment?
So yes, with Unitrends Cloud, you'll be able to fail over Nutanix running VMware and Hyper-V, as well as your other hypervisors, including Acropolis. A couple caveats just to note that, because I could just give you a simple yes and walk away, and then we kind of figure things out later, but I don't mind being open about nuances here. So for the hypervisor level backups, Unitrends won't have Nutanix stood up in our cloud as a failover option. If you wanted to use the Unitrends Cloud, you would leverage agents in some of those VMs and leverage that approach to have the backups done and replicated and failed over into Unitrends Cloud. That is something we do plan on adding, but that's going to be demand-based. So by all means, come in and demand it, and we can kind of figure things out from there and start bringing that type of infrastructure into the Unitrends Cloud so we have Acropolis out there. But since you asked just generically around Nutanix, of course, especially Nutanix running VMware and Hyper-V.
All right. Well, we're just about out of time here. As a reminder, this webinar was recorded, and you'll receive an email with a link to the on-demand version of the webinar within the next 24 hours. We'll also announce the winner of the $100 gift card in that email, and we'll contact the winner via email this afternoon. Thanks again for joining us, and we look forward to having you on future webinars. Take care, everybody.
Great. Thanks, folks.